Okay, hi everyone. I'm back with another video review. This is the Burson Playmate 2. This is a DAC and amplifier unit, desktop size as you can tell on the screen. Firstly, I just want to thank Bob at Burson Audio for giving me the chance to listen to this for an extended period. This has been pretty exciting for me. I'm always interested in hearing different desktop DACs and amps, and this is no exception for being a very unique one at that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go into this Burson Playmate. So on the back, we have actually a USB-C input, which is very different than most, I guess, hi-fi desktop DAC amps. Most of them use a USB-B connector. So this is pretty unique in that they're using a USB-C. If you guys are using an audiophile grade USB cable, just keep in mind that this is USB-C. The only other input for this device is a Toslink digital input, so that's kind of a bummer that there's only two inputs. For most people, the USB option will be the primary choice of input, and then for people who want to connect this device to a console or a gaming console, you can use the Toslink digital input. In terms of output, this is a preamplifier output. I believe the voltage output is a whopping 13 volts, so just be careful when you're using this as a preamp. And then we have our DC input here for power. On the front of the unit, we have a 6.3 millimeter headphone output. Over here, we have a 4-pole 3.3 millimeter headphone dual audio and voice input. So in the box, there's actually this really cool adapter that splits your mic and audio here. You can just plug that like there, and then you can have your game audio from that. Pretty nice. Over here, we have a display that shows you volume information as well as kind of the input that you have, as well as the sample rate and any filters that you're using. Over here, we have a button, and over here, we have a button as well. This is an IR sensor, so this actually does have a remote control that you can use with it, but I didn't use it during my extended listening period. And as you can tell, these top screws and these top screws here are removed, and that's for good reason, because just like the Burson Fun that I reviewed a couple months ago, you can actually take the cover off, reveal the inside, and just like the Fun, you can actually replace the op amps in the circuit. So if you have any additional op amps that you want to use, you can go ahead and swap these four out. I will get more into the sound of this later, but I just want to point this out that these are removable op amps, and you can change the sound of the circuit based on those op amps. So putting the cover on just for now, this also has the same power filtration system as the Burson Fun. So it has the max current power supply. So that basically takes DC input and filters it so that you have clean power throughout the entire system. And this is better than the standard linear power supply that a lot of hi-fi devices use, as well as the specialized toroidal transformers that they use as well. So because of this nice power filtration, it creates a blacker background for devices, as well as making the instrument separation just a lot better overall. And that's kind of a common theme for the Burson products so far, from what I've heard between the Playmate 2 and the Fun, is that the background is very black, instrument separation is wonderful. Also, as you can tell, this is a pretty unique looking chassis. These are all little grooves that help dissipate the heat, and so it does tend to get a little bit warm, but not too warm. It looks a little bit plain, but it's very functional in terms of the design. In terms of the DAC component, this is actually using a Sabre DAC, so I haven't heard a Sabre DAC in quite some time, so this was kind of a surprise for me to see this being put into a device again. So this is a ESS ES9038Q2M DAC chip in here. So it has up to DSD 512 or 32-bit 768 kilohertz audio, PCM. Interestingly enough, for this ESS DAC, there's a lot of digital options that you can do on the Playmate 2 to help tune the sound to your liking. So Traditionally, ESS DACs have been very strict in terms of the design and how you can tune the sound. So this is kind of a surprise to me to see this much flexibility within an ESS DAC. So some things that you can change are the DPLL, or digital phase lock loop. So that helps with the timing and the overall jitter performance of the Playmate 2. You can also change the de-emphasis filter. So if you have some Redbook audio songs that have a de-emphasis filter for the 15 or 50 microsecond high frequency adjustment, you can use that on here as well. And to my surprise, you can actually change the digital filters on the Playmate 2 using the ESS options that they have. They have a whole bunch of different ones. I think there's 6 or 8 different ones. I was primarily using the LP fast filter, which I would assume is the linear phase fast filter, which is kind of like a brick wall filter, except they actually do have a brick wall filter delimitation. So I don't know exactly what the different filters are. I'll put on the screen the different frequency responses of these filters. However, these don't tell you the time domain changes that these filters do. So on the screen, I'll also put the ESS Sabre actual specifications for their digital filters on there, so you guys can get an idea of what they might do for the sound. This is also a preamp. However, the RC output is only 15 ohms, which is a very low impedance. So I was a bit confused as to why they had such a low output impedance. Usually it's like in the hundreds, so that you can get a voltage output through the RCA jacks instead of a current output, which is kind of what this low output resistant RCA is doing. And again, this is a 13 volt preamp output. So it is adjustable with the volume knob, but just be very careful when you're connecting the Playmate 2 to other amplifiers out there. In terms of power output, speaking of which, this is a very powerful unit. There's a lot of power that this can deliver. So at 16 ohms, it's a whopping 3.5 watts. At 32 ohms, it's 2.5 watts. At 100 ohms, it's 600 milliwatts, which is kind of a standard number. And then at 300 ohms, it's at a 150 milliwatt output power. So lots of power output. The signal to noise ratio is kind of standard. So at the lowest point, which is at 300 ohms, the signal to noise ratio is at 95 decibels. So not too shabby. So speaking of power output, I was mostly using the Playmate 2 with the Vocal Clear, as well as the Audeze LCD2 headphones. One of the things that I had an issue with was when you connect this to power and you power it on, the volume knob is extremely not very usable. So even at the volume 1 setting, because even on low power output, I was not very happy with how loud it sounded. I would have preferred to have a more usable volume range. However, if you find that you have music that is listenable at volume 1, turning this to, say, volume 25, you actually get some nice wiggle room in terms of the volume that you're using. So if you can use the Playmate 2 with volume 1, then the output is actually not too bad in terms of the volume adjustment as you're turning the knob. Another issue that I had with the volume is that sometimes the volume knob's not very responsive, so I'm spinning this volume knob really fast, but the volume doesn't change a whole lot faster. So it's kind of an unresponsive volume knob. And then on the menu system, it's pretty straightforward. So as I was talking about, I was using the low output instead of the high output. So I'm not really sure when somebody would use high, because the low is already way too loud for me for my general listening preferences. And then yeah, digital filters can be applied here. So you have these different options here. And that was the brick wall filter that I was talking about earlier. These are the digital phase lock loops that you can change. You can change it to high, mid, low, or off. I'm not really sure why anybody would want to turn that off, but I was using it on high mostly. So yeah, pretty simple menu system. Anyways, going back to the sound, from the stock sound, this has a very typical kind of Sabre sound to it. I hate using that term, but it is something that you can hear as you listen to different brands of DACs. So the saber sound, if you guys don't know, or some people call it the saber glare, is basically kind of a high upper mid-range kind of harshness sound to it. It makes things sound a little bit glary, a little bit more forward, or a little bit harsh in that region. So that's kind of what people mean by the saber sound. It's kind of interesting because AKM DACs, they call it velvet sound, which is kind of the opposite of the saber sound. It's more of a warm and inviting kind of sound. So talking about this with the stock op amps, which again I will point out are the op amps up here. These are the stock ones. The bass overall, mostly because I think of the power filtration, has a pretty nice impact, but it doesn't really extend too far down for what I listen to. So it's kind of a rolled off sounding bass, but it has nice impact. Moving on to the mid-range, these mids are kind of where the Playmate 2 kind of have an emphasis. Again, especially the upper mid-range because of that saber sound effect, but they are pretty well defined. They're nice and centered, and as you go up to the upper mids, it's a little bit too harsh for me. And then as you go into the highs, what I found with a lot of saber DACs is that they tend to have some grain. So it has good texture and good definition, but as you listen to it more, like cymbals and other kind of sounds in that range sound a little bit like crunchy and grainy. Not too harsh though, which is good. So it's still listenable, but just a little bit more textured than I think should be in the sound. And then just like what I was talking about with the max current power supply, I think the instrument separation is fantastic on this unit. And just like the Burson Fun, I found that the soundstage is more kind of stereo, so very left and right sounding, not very deep. However, this all kind of changes when you try to switch out the op amps. So let me show you on camera a little bit about what these op amps can do. So these two center ones here, these ones are the LP stage of the amplifier, which is the low pass filtration. So basically the signal from the DAC comes out. That signal gets filtered through these op amps and eventually these capacitors. And then on the outside, these two op amps are responsible for the IV stage of the amplification, or the current voltage amplification. So as the signal comes directly out of the DAC, they actually go to these first, and then they get filtered, and then to your headphone output or preamp. So I will go ahead and swap those op amps to show you kind of how to do it, and then I'll talk about the sound. Okay, so I have the op amps removed. These are the ones that I've been using mostly. So these are Burson's own V6 Vivid single op amps. So these ones will plug into the two center filtration sockets. And then I have these two as well. So these are the V6 Vivid duals. So the duals will go on the IV stage op amps. Okay, so just like that, you have your 4 op amps installed. These op amps can actually drastically change the sound, which I found really cool and fascinating because I didn't think that these components would affect the sound so much, but they actually really changed the sound and made this unit sound basically like a different unit altogether. Earlier I was talking about with the stock op amps, you get a lot of that kind of saber sound characteristic to it. These op amps basically eliminated that harshness. If you're swapping out the op amps in terms of the stages individually, I found that the 2 LP stage op amps, they really filter out the harshness of the saber sound. So that kind of makes the harshness disappear and makes the unit more listenable overall. And then as you switch the IV stage ones, those ones kind of make the sound stage more like you're listening to speakers. So instead of that kind of stereo separation that I was talking about, that's characteristic of the ESS DACs, which is very left and right, not very deep. Changing those op amps out made it sound more like you're listening to speakers. So it's like a 30-degree sound coming from your ears. So that was just a really cool overall change that these op amps all did to affect the sound. So basically, the warm sound coming from these V6 Vivid op amps really came through and really affected the overall sound. So you got a little bit more boost of the low end, so it sounded more warm and inviting, similar to an AKM DAC, and really made the extension a lot better from what I had talked about earlier when using the stock op amps. In addition, the mids came back from being a little bit more forward to being more neutral to my ears. So that was a little bit more listenable to me. It wasn't as fatiguing, and the mids weren't just overpowering everything else. So that was also a benefit of swapping out those op amps. Thirdly, the highs, as I mentioned, they were sounding a little bit grainy. That became a little bit smoothed out with these op amps. These sound much more neutral sounding, a lot less harsh sounding, still retaining that good texture, but just not as much texture, so it wasn't too grainy sounding. However, on the other hand, swapping to these op amps, the instrument separation seemed to decrease a little bit, maybe because of the angling of the sound from the soundstage, how it's coming from left and right. Now it's more directly towards your face, so it kind of reduced the instrument separation a bit, but because this unit has very strong instrument separation as a whole, it didn't really detract from the listening experience. So overall, after changing out the op amps, you can definitely tell the sound is very different than when it was from stock. And to me, having these 4 op amps in here installed is pretty much a mandatory thing for the sound because it just sounds way better. So in terms of the price, the unit is $544, I believe, USD stock, and then a whopping $200 more when you add in the op amps. So that is a cost addition if you want to get these op amps installed. And I do think that the op amps themselves are a really cool way to change the sound. So if you choose to buy the Burson Playmate 2 with the stock op amps, not these upgraded ones, it gives you the option to try different op amps. Another one that a lot of people seem to like are the Sparkos brands ones. I don't have those on hand. I was only given the V6 Vivids to try out, and boy did I like the sound a lot. So if I were to recommend the Burson Playmate 2, I would definitely recommend the V6 Vivid op amps, but given that you have the option to try different op amps, you can go ahead and op amp roll. You can try different op amps, different brands. So it's a really cool way to be able to change the sound either on one stage, on a different stage, or both stages of the post DAC signal processing. So it's a really cool way to get into that. As a whole, I definitely really enjoyed the sound of the Playmate 2, but yes, adding those op amps really changed the game in terms of the overall sound. In terms of the power output, I do still have issues with that. It was still way too loud for my preferences, so that's one of the downsides of having the powerful headphone amplifier. But if you can work past that, then I think this is a very fantastic desktop DAC amp as a whole. Very clean sounding, and if you can listen to the Sabre sound, kudos to you. Then the stock operational amplifiers that are within the Playmate 2 will be okay for you. For me, I prefer greatly the op amps from the V6 Vivid, which are Burson's own discrete op amps, so they're house made and are probably meant to work well with all their products, but based on my experience with the Fun and the Playmate 2 now, I think those op amps are doing really something good for the sound. Overall, 2 thumbs up. I really like this unit with the swapped out op amps. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next video.